So my friends, I will see you in a few minutes time. About 5 minutes, okay? Have a little break yourself, let your brain calm down. See you soon. onwards we go with chapter number 3. And we're now going to look at the roles of non-executive directors. Companies have had non-executive directors for years. Non-executive means they're not involved in the running of the company. And in the past, non-executives would be on the board for all manner of reasons. Sometimes the non-executives were simply the executives who had recently retired but wanted to still play a part in the company, and the company wanted them to stick around because of all their inherent knowledge and experience from their time as an executive in the past. So they were sort of semi-retired executives. They'd come to board meetings, give their view, and then they'd go home. Some companies wanted people on their board as non-executives, not for what they would do, but because of who they were. So for example, if a politician has recently retired from politics, because they would know a lot of important people who make the laws of the land, and because their name would be very well known by a lot of your shareholders, having them on your board would look good, even if they didn't really do that much. But that is not what corporate governance wants non-executives for. As a result, about 16, 17 years ago, actually maybe about 15 years ago to be precise, a report was done recommending what would make non-executives an effective part of corporate governance. And they came up with 4 roles. Strategy, scrutiny, risk, and people. Well, strategy is decided at main board meetings. And one of the advantages of having a unitary board, so one board with all the executives and non-executives on it, is that there can be an open, transparent debate about what the strategy of the company should be, because the non-executives are in the room. They can question the strategy there and then. Scrutiny is keeping an eye on everything the executives do, their performance in their role, to make sure the shareholders are getting value for the fairly large amounts of money that those executives are getting paid. The risk role is actually quite a varied role, and what it says here in the notes probably needs a little bit more. It's not just the risk management process, it's also helping to set the risk strategy, so how risky do we want to be. It's also about overseeing internal controls, and it's also about overseeing the financial statements. And since you are overseeing controls and financial statements, that also means overseeing and liaising with the auditors, both internal and external. Which means this bit of the non-executive role will be done as members of an audit committee, and possibly a separate risk committee as well, if you want to break that exercise up into 2. People role looks at 2 main things. Who is on the board and how much they get paid. Well, who is on the board is delegated to a separate committee called the Nomination Committee. And what directors get paid is delegated to the Remuneration Committee. So if you get an exam question that says, what do non-executives do? You could go by the 4 roles. But if you were to explain what the audit committee does, the remuneration committee does, and the nomination committee does, you're actually going to pick up on quite a bit of non-executive roles, because they are the people who fill those committees, and therefore whatever those committees are doing is non-executive roles. When we went through the 11 principles of corporate governance, one of those was independence. And I said to you, of course, external auditors must be independent. We know that from F8. But on P1, we also look at the independence of internal audit, which will come up later in the course. The chairman should be independent, and also non-executives. Now, before we get into this, one important point. If any member of the audit team, the external audit team, is not independent, they must be removed from that team. If you have got a non-executive who's not independent, they don't have to be removed from the company. As long as there are enough independent non-executives on the board to balance out the ones who are not independent, you can keep non-execs who are not independent. So it doesn't work quite the same way as audit. Having said all that, the examples coming up in the notes here of why a non-executive would not be considered independent are remarkably similar to what you learned on F8 about auditors. So before we look at these notes, let's have a little think back to F8. If the auditors own shares in the company, have relatives working at the company, if the auditors used to work at the company, if the auditors have some sort of business relationship with the company, if the auditors have audited the company for several years in a row, all of those would be examples where the auditor's independence would come into question. And what you're about to see looks remarkably similar, because non-executives will not be deemed independent if they've worked at the company within the last 5 years, or had any sort of business relationship in the last 3. How do auditors get paid? A fee based on the number of hours of work that were done. So how do we pay non-executives? A fee for the number of meetings that they've had to attend to fulfill their director's duties. They get paid by the hour, just like auditors. Why do we want no performance-related pay? To keep them independent. Yeah, okay, but what do we mean by that? If they got performance-related pay, then we immediately get a self-interest threat. For example, there's a danger that they side with the executives and say yes to high-risk strategies because they want the payoff. Well, the problem is that one of the reasons the non-executives are there are to balance out excessive risk-taking by the executives. The executives will get performance-related pay And if the non-executives are paid just like the executives, then the danger is that for shareholders, the non-execs just look like more executives, which doesn't give the assurance that they are different and looking at things from a different angle. Now, this is quite a controversial area. In America, non-executives often do get performance-related pay because they favour a different argument, which is if the non-executives stand to win or lose based on the performance of the company, then they're more likely to care. If they just get a fixed fee, they could turn up to the meeting, drink the nice wine, take the money and go home. Why care? So there are arguments in both directions with some areas of governance, and this is one of them. But in the UK, we argue, no, it is better that, like the auditors, they are paid a fixed fee so they can be separated from the benefits of the performance of the company. No close family ties, just like auditors, familiarity threat. And then we get a slightly odd-looking one. What is a cross-directorship? Let's say, for example, that the chairman of company A is called Mr. A, the chairman of company B is Mrs. B. But Mr. A is a non-executive on company B's board. And Mrs. B is a non-executive on company A's board. Hence, a cross-directorship. So what? Well, before we look at the rights and wrongs of this, what could cause this to happen? This could be a perfectly sensible business arrangement. Maybe company A and company B work together a lot, have some sort of strategic alliance, and having one of the other company's people on your board can help make sure that you're considering things together. But that benefit is also the problem. Because Mr. A and Mrs. B are not independent. Because when Mrs. B is sitting on the company A board, Mrs. B should be thinking about what is in the best interests of company A's shareholders. But presumably company A and B are linked in some way, and she's going to be sitting there thinking also about what is best for company B, where she's the chairman. And likewise, Mr. A is going to have this conflict. One of the biggest worries about something like this is it's not been done as a strategy decision to bring the two companies closer together. Instead, Mr. A has arranged for Mrs. B to be on his board. In return, Mrs. B has made sure Mr. A is on her board, and that means the two of them are going to see a lot of each other. And when Mr. A, as chairman, says, I think this should happen at company A, I would imagine Mrs. B will support him, knowing that if she says similar at company B, Mr. A will support her. This is an attempt at a power base. Surround yourself with friends. Do each other favours. And the thing is, if they are not independent NEDs, then there's limited usage for them at those two companies. For example, they can't sit on the audit committee because that's only independent NEDs. They can't sit on the remuneration committees because those are only independent NEDs. In fact, in reality, you probably wouldn't use them on any committees, which means you'd probably have to hire an additional non-executive to fill the roles that these people can't do. Cross-directorships happened a lot in the past. In the UK, they are not banned. In some countries, they are, because they're seen as underhand. So if you're going to have a cross-directorship, bear in mind your shareholders are likely to spot it, so make sure you explain to them why you're doing it, and realise that the non-executives that you are creating by doing this are not independent. If an auditor has been auditing a company for many years in a row, they will lose their independence, and the same is true with non-executives. With the partner on the audit, 7 years is what we typically look at. With non-executives, it tends to be 9. And if a non-executive is a major shareholder in the company, that also means they're not independent. Now you might say, hang on a minute. Surely, if they're a shareholder, they will care about what shareholders care about, which is the whole point of NEDs. The difficulty is no. They will care about their shareholder position. That is not necessarily at the same level of interests as all other shareholders. For example, maybe this NED wants to sell their shares because they're short of money. A bid comes in for the company, which is way too low. What the board should be saying is, shareholders, we don't think we should accept this. This is not good value. But the non-executive might want to say we should accept it, because unless everyone else accepts it, he can't sell his shares and get the money he desperately needs. So what are the benefits of non-executives then? Well, the main benefits link back to the roles that they fulfill. They will challenge the executives and not let them get away, hopefully, with silly strategies. They'll keep an eye on the executives' performance, which will help to hold them accountable to the shareholders. If we decide, as a society, that companies don't just owe a duty of care to shareholders, but should be considering customers, suppliers, the environment, and any other stakeholders, those non-executives can be legally charged with considering all relevant stakeholder groups. They can help stop the executives picking their mates by having an independent nomination committee. They can help stop the executives overpaying themselves by having an independent remuneration committee. And they can help provide assurance on controls, risk management and audit through the audit committee. So it's a mixture of challenge, scrutiny, oversight, all there to help shareholders and maybe other stakeholders feel assured. This chapter looks at directors, and what we need to do now is consider the CEO and the chairman. The title in the notes says CEO and chairman and splitting the roles, but before we do that, we ought to look at what a chairman does and what the CEO does. Well, we know the chairman runs the board. What does that actually mean? It means things like setting the board agenda, ensuring a strong tone at the top of the company, so ethical, legal, etc. ensuring corporate governance guidelines are met, making sure that all directors are contributing, they're not just turning up and falling asleep in the corner. But as the person in charge of the board, the chairman also has some other roles which are more external. Being the point of contact when shareholders want the board to understand what they're thinking. So we saw Schroders earlier, not happy with a takeover that Tesco's are considering. So Schroders contacted the chairman of Tesco's to explain why they weren't happy. The chairman's job then is to share shareholder views with the rest of the board. The chairman is also there to be the face of the company. So, for example, if TV or newspaper want interviews, the chairman is typically the person who does them. The chairman presents the AGM and things like that. And possibly one of the more common examples of what a chairman does is they oversee the chief executive. They are the CEO's boss. Well, there's a little range of things that the chairman does. What does the chief executive do? Well, their job is to run the company. So when the board have agreed a strategy, the chief executive's job is to execute it, make it happen. So making sure the company has the financial clout to do what has been decided. Put control systems in place. Put risk management procedures in place. So basically, it's all aspects of the operation of the company. Obviously, the lower level day-to-day operational stuff will be delegated down through levels of management, but the CEO is in charge of the whole thing. So why should one person not do both? Well, the main reason, which is the most obvious one, I suppose, is if one person did both, they would be very, very powerful indeed. They would control the discussion at board meetings, meaning they could make sure they got the conclusion they wanted, and then they would go and put that conclusion, that strategy into place. They would be able to do what they liked, basically. But that's not the only reason. Another reason to split the two is time. The chief executive is a full-time job. And by full-time, I don't mean roll in at 9 o'clock and leave at 5. I mean they are going to be working 7 days a week. And then you want them to be chairman as well. Well, the chairman's got to organise board meetings, chivvy up the other directors to make sure they're turning up and they're prepared. No. The whole point of splitting the two roles is you have two people doing the two roles. If you had one person doing both, that would increase their power. Our job is to reduce their power. So the arrow is the right way around. No, decrease. Make sense? No problem. So the chief executive is a full-on job in its own right. The chairman is not quite such a full-on job. I would say the average chairman probably works 2 to 3 days a week and will have other jobs as non-executives at other companies. Because the board is not always meeting, and if the board's not meeting, yeah, you've got to keep an eye on the chief executive, but you have no executive role. You're not involved in the running of the company. So it's about 1.5 jobs if you're doing both, and a big company especially a company if it's got problems, this is too much for one person. And the other reason I would say for splitting the roles is the two jobs are totally different. Now you might be able to find someone who is capable of doing both skill sets. But the chairman job is a talking job. It's a persuasion job. It's keeping the team of directors working well together, happy together, breaking up fights and arguments. It's a diplomacy job. The job of the chief executive is to come up with good strategies and then after the board meeting to go and do them. Typically by getting a lot of people to do things that they might not actually want to do. It's a very forceful job. You need someone with a lot of energy who can make people do things whether they like it or not. Those are two fairly different personalities, I think you'll find. So for a number of reasons, having one person as chairman and chief executive is probably not a very clever idea. And yet again, this is not something that is agreed worldwide. In America, a lot of people are chairman and chief executive, because in America they like the idea that one person is in charge of everything. If things go well, pat them on the back, and if things go badly, we know who to sack. So there are arguments in other directions. Some operational stuff now. When we take on a new director, the moment they start work for our company, they have legal duties to act in the best interests of shareholders, not break the law, and stuff like that. That means that when we bring someone new onto the board, before day one, we need to prepare them for this role. Now, it largely depends on whether this person has been promoted from within the company or if they're being brought in from outside. I'm going to focus on being brought in from outside because that gives a bigger answer. They need to know and understand the company. Because if you're at the top of it, you need to know how the whole thing works. They need to know organisation chart, especially the management roles at the top. To help understand what the company does and how it does it, if we've got major manufacturing sites, major distribution sites, big offices in certain locations, we'd want them to visit them, get a feel for what's going on there, and of course meet key people as well. Especially if they come in from outside, industry laws and regulations. Secondly, they need to understand their duties. Now, if they've been a director before, this might not be such a big issue. But if it's their first time as a director, we need them to understand their corporate governance duties. And as an important member of the company, we need them to know who key stakeholders are and meet them. So major shareholders, customers, suppliers, regulators, and people like that. And if you are a new director on a board, how do you help to understand the company a bit more? You read things that most people don't get access to. Read the recent board minutes to understand what the big issues have been and what different board members think about those issues. What control problems, risk management problems have the internal auditors been highlighting? And to know where the company is at the moment and where it is heading, management accounts, forecasts, strategy documents, board reports, anything along those lines. So those are the sort of things I would involve in induction in a new director. But the notes only mention induction. And that's good for when we take a new director on. But going forward, it can't all be at the beginning. We also need directors to have training and development. Now that will be a mixture of things. It will be training in the latest corporate governance changes, training in the latest accounting standard updates, changes in the law, changes in tax. But it will also be personal development. As a director, you have got to influence other people, present to other people, build teams with other senior members of the company. And those sort of skills come naturally to some people and need to be developed in others. If you're the chairman and you are the face of the company, you're going to be interviewed on television, you'll probably need media training. So on a regular basis, minimum annually, each director's training needs need to be assessed and planned for the following year. On the next page, the company secretary is largely there to assist the chairman. They are there in a sort of administrative capacity, largely to make sure that all the formal side of running a company, so fulfilling corporate governance, making sure the returns that need to go to Companies House to keep the list of directors and shareholders and stuff like that up to date, are all happening properly, making sure notice for the AGM goes out on time, etc., etc. The company secretary is typically a professionally trained person. Their training tends to be a mixture of legal, corporate governance, accounting. And that means they can be a useful resource for the board of directors as a whole, advising on making sure the company's not doing anything illegal, breaching the Companies Act, etc. It is often said that directors' duties can be split into two. Loyalty to the company and a duty of diligence or care and skill. Because you are making important decisions at the head of a company, so we want you to carry out those decisions to the highest possible standard. All fairly basic stuff. But it does allow us to raise one particular topic, which is insider dealing. As a director, you will have access to information which the outside world does not yet know. That might be good news, or it might be bad news. And if you know some good news that the rest of the world doesn't know yet, you could go and buy company shares using that information, because the share price won't reflect it yet because no one else knows. Similarly, you could sell shares knowing the price is likely to come down in the near future. Insider dealing is illegal, so don't do it. It is also a self-interest issue. You are making yourself rich at the expense of other shareholders. A conflict of interest. If you do something illegal, you can be prosecuted, and that can lead to you going to prison. It can lead to you being disqualified as a director, meaning you can't be a director of any company for several years into the future. If you do something illegal, or you just do something stupid, a lack of care, well, you might not get prosecuted by the state if you've not broken any laws, but you certainly can be sued by shareholders and maybe others who say they've lost money as a result of your poor quality performance. We're starting to head now towards why directors leave companies. And it might surprise you, there is a rather long list of methods. Many of them are just like you or I leaving our job. We can resign. We can be fired for bad performance. And yes, dying or simply disappearing is enough for a company to say they've clearly gone. And yes, when this has come up as a past exam question, saying death or disappearing for several months did get marks. They are perfectly valid answers. Don't forget that directors are typically on no more than 3 years before their next election at the AGM. And one way to leave a company is put yourself up for election and the shareholders say no. Or choose not to put yourself up for election. So when it comes to your re-election at the end of 3 years, say you don't want to do it anymore. and just leave. You've not resigned, you've let your contract expire. Sometimes, as noted, you will be disqualified if you do something illegal, and that could be simple admin stuff like repeatedly failing to file company returns, submit accounts. All of that stuff can lead to you being disqualified as a director from all companies. I mentioned this point earlier, it now gets a little mention in the notes. If you have got a non-executive who has been on your board for 9 years already, you are allowed to keep them on board. You'll have to persuade the shareholders they're worth keeping, because if they're no longer independent, you've either got to try to argue they are independent, even though they've been there longer than 9 years, and you might be able to justify that. Or you've got to say, I know they're not independent, but they provide such benefits to this board through their experience, knowledge, contacts and skill. I don't care they're not independent. We still want to keep them. And then we get to what I think is one of the more difficult areas of governance. The board should have its performance evaluated every year, because if you want an effective board, you'd better measure whether you're getting one. And that raises two rather important questions. Who should do the evaluation? And how? Well, unfortunately, most board evaluations are done by the board. They evaluate themselves. And if the board are going to evaluate themselves, there's a very obvious self-review threat. I mean, you could try and be a little bit clever, and we'll see how that might work in a minute or two. But at the end of the day, if directors are evaluating directors, they're evaluating themselves. It is preferable to use some sort of external expert. And there are external board consultants out there. And if you're going to use external experts, we need to try and work out how they're going to do this. Just before we get that far, if the board is going to do this itself, how might it do it? Okay, let's have a look at a board then. So we've got the chairman, CEO, the other execs. We've got the senior independent director and the other NEDs. But then those are also on a series of committees. So audit, nomination, remuneration, and committees will have a committee chairman and the other committee members. So where could we get this evaluation to happen? Well, Sid, the senior independent director, could review the performance of the chairman. The other non-executives could perhaps review how well the senior independent director has done. The chairman can review the chief executive. The chief executive could review his or her team. The committee chairman could review the performance of each committee member. But who's going to review the non-executives? Because at the moment, no one's reviewing them. Yeah, difficult. Probably the chairman. But now we've got a bit of a circular thing going on, and this is clearly self-review. You can try and structure it to minimise the self-review threat a bit, but you'll never get rid of it totally. Which is why an external review would make more sense. If you're going to use an external expert, what will that expert do? Because if they're external, how do they know what the board are doing? Well, they would need to attend some board and committee meetings. They would need to interview every director individually, probably anonymously, so they can collect information without directors being scared that what they say about other members of the board will count against them. And it might be a good idea to also interview the people just below board level, because their bosses are the directors, and ask them what they think about the performance of the people just above them. And what criteria are you going to evaluate on? Participation. So, do the directors contribute to discussions? Are they turning up to board meetings and committee meetings having done the necessary preparation work? Have they read the board reports, for example? Now those two things are looking more at individual performance. We've also got to look at whether the board itself is a good board. So that's individual directors. How do we know if we've got a good board? Well, you could assess the balance of skills, experience, and diversity that you've got on the boards. Or the board, even. Clarity of purpose. Is it clear what the board are trying to achieve and everyone is following that? Values. Are they clearly telling the rest of the company what the company is trying to achieve and how it's trying to behave? You could look at the level of communication with shareholders at the annual general meeting, how many other sort of meetings go on. In fact, you could interview the big shareholders and ask how happy they are. You could look at succession planning and how well that's been done. So when one director leaves, another comes in, how effective has that been managed? And stuff like that. Now, evaluation of a board hardly ever comes up on the exam. The reason I'm going through it with a little bit of detail is I think this is quite hard. As with everything in corporate governance, I'm taking you through the notes and sharing examples with you. Every board has got to do this stuff. And everything a board does that's corporate governance has to be disclosed and explained in detail in their annual report. If you'd like to know what board evaluations look like in the real world, go and pick any company on the stock exchange, and there are loads of them, you know, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Vodafone, Shell, BP, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline. There are loads. Go and look at their most recent annual report on their website. Go and find the corporate governance section and have a quick skim read through. You'll often find that things will stick a lot better if you're seeing real world news than if you're just hearing me going through the notes. It's why I'm giving you as many examples as I can. But it's all out there. Go and have a look yourself. You don't need to read 20 annual reports. One would be a start. And that's board evaluation. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3. Yay. And the end of class number 3. Now I'll be honest with you, we have 8 classes. In the first 3 classes we've seen 3 chapters. There are more than 8 chapters. But do not worry, because some of the chapters coming up are very, very quick and short. We've done most of the corporate governance stuff already. There's a little bit left to do in chapters 4, 5 and 6, but almost all of it we've touched on in advance. But for now, that is the end of class number 3. We've still not reached a point where we can have a look at a full exam question. It's one of the issues with 25-mark questions and no MCQs. We have to get a fair way into the course before we can start looking, but next time we will look. For now, thank you all very much. Keep reading the newspapers. cityam.com is your friend, and it's free, unlike the Financial Times. And I will see you in 7 days' time when we will reach the halfway point and class number 4. Until then, good evening and thank you very much.